So, you want to learn how to use geometry nodes to create illustrations or animations in Grease Pencil that look something like my short Kick It. So, to do this, I'm going to show you my most default basic setup. It's probably inelegant, there's probably much better ways to do it. I in fact recommend you go look at Daniel Martínez Lara's Cowboy demo and look at his Blender file because he's probably much better at this than I am. But I'll show you what I did and how I set up my own project. So to start out, you go to 2D animation. We have our beautiful default Blender file. I'm going to delete all these extra materials I don't care about. And something very important is off rip. Select your stroke, R, X, 90, to rotate it 90 degrees on the X axis. Go into draw mode and set your drawing plane to top. There are some settings in our geometry node setup that will require this to be functional. So this is very important to get down. So I'm not going to animate anything particularly in depth just yet. In fact, I'm going to get rid of any extra layers. So a note on how this setup works is each grease pencil object, so each unique stroke here that shows up in the collection, will be assigned its own materials and modifiers. If you want something to have a different color or different material, it has to be separated into its own stroke. That's just for helping you plan things out. Essentially, each stroke is going to be our little bucket of paint on the palette. So, what we're going to do is actually set up our geometry node engine. We're going to go to General, Geometry Nodes, and I have a pretty simple layout that I like to use for a sort of bulky clay feeling to your 2D line art. So to do this, I'm just going to copy and paste a geometry node setup I know works. I'm going to click New, and this is our default geometry node window. If you have not used this before, this is basically a very simple visual programming window where you can set up node trees to do fancy things to your animation. You can press Shift A to search for something. We're going to get grease pencil to curves. And we're going to turn off layers as instances. It sometimes breaks things, so don't worry about it. We're going to add fill curve. This will convert our curve into a filled mesh, and this is the part that breaks if we didn't rotate it and draw the top plane earlier. We're going to add extrude mesh. This extrudes our mesh out into space. You control how far with this offset. And we're also going to add a flip faces. We add a join geometry. This will be important once we turn things into a volume instead of a mesh. We're going to add mesh to volume. This converts our mesh into a volume, which solves some z-fighting, smooths things out. We're going to change it to size, and change our voxel size down to 0.1. Lower the interior bandwidth. Then we add volume to mesh. And change that to size. Change the voxel size down to 0.1. And last things we need to add. This isn't technically necessary, but I like it. It's a set position. We're going to use this to blur an attribute. So we're just going to basically blur the edges of this a little bit. Position. This will give us some softer corners to value, and it will be a vector. So the iterations control basically how simplified your shape is going to be. It makes it softer, smoother, less jagged. I find it very helpful. We're going to add a set shade smooth to have nice smooth shading. As you can see here, it hides those polygons even without raising the polygon count. And set material. So this is my default clay setup. So now we're going to actually add a material to this. For this, I open a general shading window. We come to the Materials tab, click on New, New, and give this a name. I'm going to call this Hair Body. Now that we've created it, we have to go back to Geometry Nodes and tell it that's the material we're going to use, Hair Body. And now our changes to this material will update in real time. A very basic, but very flexible material I like creating is just adding a noise texture, a color ramp, that you can Control-C, Control-V to make two of, and a bump. I hook the fac on each of these color ramps. I hook the color on the bottom one to height and normal to normal. What this is doing is creating fake bumps of depth that will capture light on our 3D material. So you can see here, this is controlled by our noise texture. You can get it to whatever you like. There's a lot you can do just with a simple noise texture. You can control the distance of the bumps as well as their strength with this bump node. And then I hook the color to our base color. Now, you can change this color to be whatever you like. This gives you a controllable ramp over the object that, if you'd like, you can even add more points to. So let's add some in the middle here. So you can create some very strange, odd-looking textures. And again, since they're both controlled by this noise texture, you can do a whole lot to play with them. You can hook this color to other values like the index of refraction or the alpha. If you'd like odd transparencies, differences in roughness. Probably the bottom color ramp will do you the best to keep things clean and simple without mixing in the colors. Yes, you can also slide this bottom color ramp around once it's done loading. Let's remove these to control just how far the bumps will go and what parts are affected by these bumps. So it looks like we have a sort of strange, interesting stone here. Let's make it shiny. Great. There's one other geometry node setup we could use. I will Shift A to add a grease pencil D. And again, we have to rotate this on the x-axis by 90. You can draw if you like to test out. And we're going to add another geometry node setup for this. New. And this is going to be our setup for line art, basically. So this one is much simpler, much easier to understand. We're again going to add a grease pencil to curves, turn off layers to instances. We're going to add a curve to mesh. We're going to add a curve circle to control the profile of this curve. And you can see already that has generated circles all along this geometry that you can control with the radius right here. We can set fill caps to fill in the ends of the lines too. We can add a set material. And now, just like before, we have to add a material to this line. So I'll come to my material tab, press new, say line mat. You could add some fancy noise textures if you'd like to. A noise. Color ramps are great, one of my favorite nodes. Back to fac, color to base color. And remember, to see it updating, you have to enable it on the set material node under geometry nodes. So we set this to line mat, and now you can see these colors updating in real time as we slide things around. I'll hook this to emission as well. So we now have our two objects in space with geometry nodes applied to them. If you'd like to work without the geometry nodes, you can just turn off this little window button here on each of them. Object mode to select our stroke. I'll call this care body, and this one will be care lines. So again, for the way I have this set up, it is easiest to have each element of the character that's going to need its own material separated into its own object. We can arrange these in space if we'd like to. In object mode, you just press G and arrange them on the y-axis. I'll make a copy of our care body. Control C, Control V. I'll select it, I'll name this background. I'm going to G, grab it, and slide it Y all the way back. and that will be a nice background element for it. I'm going to change the shading on it as well. Since it's a copied object, not instanced, it has its own shader automatically that we can mess with and do as we please. I'll do the same copy and paste. This one will be called foreground. I'll press G to grab it, slide it towards the camera, select it, and mess with it. I want to make sure our lines are going to be in front of our fill, so I'll go to Object Mode, select them, G, Y, slide them in front. Now we're ready to start actually illustrating. Only thing left to do is, if you want to have a depth of field effect, select your camera in Object Mode, go to Camera, enable depth of field, lower your f-stop all the way down, and select the object you want to focus on, or the focal depth manually. If we slide these things around to get them a bit out of the way, you can see the things in front of and behind our main object are now nicely blurred. So we can come into Draw mode, start drawing with this real-time generated 3D material. If you don't want to draw with the material being actively generated, you can just disable it again in the modifier window. Which will speed up your drawing times quite a bit. But things might look a little funky by the time you go back to the material to see what it actually looks like. Object mode, let's select our foreground object. Edit even to get rid of this blob. Yes, you will not be able to see your onion skin while this modifier is active. Come into edit mode to remove this default blob. And let's do a little drawing. If you start drawing within an existing shape, that will generate a hole. Edit mode, AX. Go back to draw. Wow, one beautiful illustration. Now, something I like adding to my own objects is a noise modifier for basically everything I do. To do that, just come to this modifier wrench tab, plus deform noise. I like lowering precision and raising scale and offset. Oh yes, and make sure you put it before the geometry node converts everything to meshes. Otherwise it won't work. I'll do the same. Something I like to change as well is the amount of times that it is randomized. By default, it's every 4 frames. For background objects, I find it's good to raise this up so they're not too distracting. Very scrungly. And for the foreground, I'll also add a less intense noise modifier that's randomized less often. So, we now have a scene with some depth, with a camera, multiple materials. We are using the default world lighting though. If you'd like to add your own lights, I'll create a new collection for lights. And I will turn down the world strength to 0. In object mode, I'll press Shift A to add a light spot. And I'll change our view to rendered by pressing Z, or just by pressing this orb up at the top right. You can press G to move around your light. It's a little creepy at the moment. So let's come to the light tab on this. Times 90 to make our light larger. You can use this arrow here to change the angle of the spotlight to light up more of the scene. By default, all of this stuff will be animating. So if you don't want it to be animated by generating keyframes automatically, make sure you turn off this little red dot here for auto keying. So we have a light. We can change the color of it if you'd like to. You can change where it is in space. We can change the rotation with unlock it to the x-axis here. And then I will Control-C, Control-V, and paste it to generate a second light. I'll just slide this forward on the y-axis, rotate it with X, and change the color of it to a red. C, V, do the same thing again. G, Z to lower it. Rotate it on the x-axis, and change the color of it. So this can influence your scene very, very strongly. You can keep some of the world lighting if you'd like to. So now you have an interesting little animated scene, jiggling around, moving. You can very easily extend this if you have a greater knowledge of Blender's 3D side, or if you're just a 2D artist that wants to play around with this, have at it. Once you're ready to render, I prefer using cycles, gives a very nice, strange film grain look to everything, and I purposefully set my samples very, very low. I set my time limit to 1, and I turn off denoising, because I like the weird grainy look that it gives. My device is set to GPU because I do have a GPU that will render things at a decent speed. You should set that for yours as well if you have one. And for your render settings, I'm just going to set this to my desktop. Now, it's always good to set it to its own folder if you'd like to. Cat demo. I'll set this to an FFmpeg. PNGs will be the best quality if you want to use this for another project. I will set the encoding to MPEG-4. Perceptually lossless, and render animation. So if you already know how to animate in Grease Pencil, there's nothing particularly different to this. You just turn off the modifier while you're working, or have it set into Eevee so you can see what the geometry is like in real time. For my short Kick It, I did a rough animation in Grease Pencil by itself first, that I used to guide all the drawings of 3D geometry I was doing, so I wouldn't have to worry about toggling back and forth between working modes.